Welcome everyone to this first session of this academic year of the Mexican Studies Seminar at the Katz Center, University of Chicago. My name is Emilio Curí. I'm the director, and we are extremely pleased today to have with us not only via Zoom, but in person here at the university, where she's been a guest of ours before, Helga Baitenmann, who I think is known to many of you. She's currently a fellow at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of London, but more importantly, a distinguished scholar and researcher of a variety of topics in Mexican modern culture and history, trained as an anthropologist, and now lately doing extraordinary archival work and working alongside historians. She is most recently the author of Matters of Justice, Pueblos, the Judiciary, and Agrarian Reform in Revolutionary Mexico. And along those lines of her recent research and other publications, we are very fortunate today to get, I think one of the first presentations of this new work that she's been doing, which promises to be very significant. If you haven't been here before, the format is very simple. She will make a presentation at the conclusion of which we will have opportunity for questions and comments. And if you are on Zoom, we'll ask you to raise your hand for those questions. If you're here, you can do it here. In any case, it is very much our pleasure and an honor to introduce today Helga Baitenmann, who will speak on Beyond Social Banditry, Reframing Revolutionary Violence in the Zapatista region, 1911 to 1919. Welcome, Helga.
Thank you very much. Emilio and I met over 30 years ago in Veracruz, and since then he's been the most generous of colleagues. So I'm incredibly pleased to be here at the Katz Center today. Alan Knight characterizes revolutionary violence in Mexico as extensive and notably demotic. As demotic or popular means that impoverished masses took reprisals against elites, reversing the typical patterns of violence during the Porfiriato. The Zapatistas would be a perfect example of this demotic violence against elites, but I see it as operating on two axes. One would be vertical or class violence, which I believe is what Alan Knight talks about, but I would like to talk about the horizontal violence directed towards villagers with scarce resources. So it is this second form of demotic violence I will be talking about today. My research is based on the very extensive archives in Mexico City, the Zapatista archives in Mexico City. Everyone who has worked with these archives knows that it contains hundreds of letters, complaints, and petitions to the Zapatista authorities from what they called pacíficos, or civilian supporters. These were men and women, mostly illiterate, who dictated their accounts to local scribes, teachers, or revolutionary secretaries, documenting the violence inflicted on them by Zapatista soldiers and higher-ranking officials. My work draws on 700 of these petitions from Morelos and the Zapatista-controlled regions of Guerrero, the state of Mexico, the southern part of the Federal District, and Puebla. Scholars have long struggled on how to interpret these complaints about violence against the Pacíficos, especially because John Womack's work portrayed villages in revolutionary Mexico as relatively harmonious. That changed with Samuel Brunk's work in the 1990s, who, with archives that Womack didn't have access to, managed to understand very deeply the fractures, the conflicts, and the violence within the movement. Felipe Ávila Espinosa, today's most famous zapatologo, and Alejandro Rodríguez Mayoral, Brunk's former doctoral student, who wrote probably the most complete book on everyday life in Zapatista villages, have further confirmed this reality. Their recent work makes violence visible, and yet they see it, and as I quote, a sign of social pathology and moral decay that affected a sector of the Zapatista army in later years. Recent scholarship on violence in Mexico, what Will Pansters calls a paradigm shift, provides a new analytic framework that enables us to recognize when violence is systemic rather than exceptional, and invites us to focus on how violence functions. And yet, this growing literature has so far sidestepped the revolutionary period. Research on 20th century violence in Mexico tends to start in the 1920s, as exemplified by Ariel Rodriguez Curi's edited volume, Violencias Mexicanas, 1920 to 2020. With 700 petitions in hand, a few of which I will read to you today, my argument is that violence in the Zapatista region was not exceptional, but systemic. Inspired by Claudio Lomnitz's work on violence, which he presents every year at the Colegio Nacional, I understand systemic violence as having at least three components: an underlying economy that fuels and sustains it, an ideology that normalizes it or justifies it as a necessary evil for a greater good, and a judicial system that leaves it unpunished through collusion and acquiescence. So let me start with the economy that fuels and sustains violence. The current narrative holds that the Zapatista economy evolved basically in two distinct phases. During the movement's ascending period, so 1911 to 1915, villages and the guerrilla army formed a functional partnership. Zapatistas provided protection from enemy armies, while civilians produced supplies. This was sustained by resources expropriated from haciendas and other wealthy properties. In the declining phase, 1916, 1919, this cooperative model ended as a much larger and permanent army now had extracted a lot of labor from the fields and the sugar industry collapsed. Facing military defeat, food shortages, and village reluctance to continue feeding the army, Zapatistas adopted increasingly coercive and violent tactics against civilian populations. That is the accepted narrative. What I have found is that from the very start, 1911, the Zapatista leadership made village assistance obligatory. And this took two forms: direct, by feeding the soldiers and the horses that came through the villages, entered the towns and then left, and indirect, through the collection of money quotas collected by whatever municipal officials were still left, and delivered to the revolutionary chiefs. When residents paid their quotas, they received receipts, sometimes called salvoconductos. Also very early on, I would say 1912, this neat division between feeding the soldiers and the horses that come into towns and the collection of quotas through municipal officials collapsed. I will read you an excerpt from Puebla in 1913. We, the residents of San Francisco Huilango, wish to inform General Fortino Ayaquica of the ongoing abuses we suffer at the hands of Captain Crescencio Vaquero. On the 1st of January, Vaquero arrived at night at the head of his soldiers, entered Zenobio Aguilar's home, and seized his two sons. They were threatened, tied together, and hung from a tree for failing to pay the 600 pesos that had been demanded of them. On the 25th of January, Pedro Peña suffered a similar attack and handed over the sum of 25 pesos, for which he received a receipt now in his wife's possession. As a result of this mistreatment, he fell ill and died within a few days. That same night, Agapito Gonzalez was ambushed and forced to hand over the sum of 100 pesos, receiving a correspondent receipt. On January 29, Natividad Peña was threatened and demanded to hand over 100 pesos. Then they took 20 pesos from Benito Peña. The elderly Pedro Montellanos was hung from a tree and injured until he handed over 100 pesos. And so the list continues until the end of May. There are many aspects to what I call the economy of forced extraction, but I will focus on the quotas and on the revolutionary receipts. So many scholars working on violence in 20th century Mexico go back to the ideas of Charles Tilly, who argued that state-making and organized crime share fundamental characteristics. They both extract rents, control territory, and provide protection. They're both forms of authority that blur boundaries between the forced and the voluntary, and between the legitimate taxation and protection rackets. We see this very clearly in the work of journalists and scholars of present-day Mexico. But the Zapatista economy operated according to this logic as well. The quota system operated like a form of taxation, with extraction adjusted according to wealth. This took a lot of local knowledge, and indeed, it was the Zapatista soldiers who emerged from these communities and knew precisely who owned property, who held savings, and who had inventory in their small stores. Zapatista chiefs extracted food, money, and labor from villages in exchange for protection against the federal army and later the Huerta and the Carrancista forces. Yet the violence from which they claimed to protect villages often emanated from their own soldiers. Receipts blurred the line between naked coercion and revolutionary contributions. This economy of forced extraction also blurred the boundary between the military and the domestic sphere. When Zapatista soldiers extracted resources from villagers, they did not simply enter the villages asking for food and fodder or get the tax collected by municipal officials. They entered individual homes. Alejandro Rodriguez Mayoral, in his book on everyday life in Zapatista villages, describes that one of the most terrifying aspects of the revolution for civilians was hearing the command, "Abran la puerta," at all hours of the night. I have found so many petitions describing precisely either the late hours or the very early hours in the morning when residents were sleeping, and a lot of descriptions about how the soldiers broke down the doors. This practice became so widespread, it required formal prohibition. There are several of these decrees and laws. A February 1914 decree, for example, by the Zapatista leadership, explicitly prohibited revolutionaries from entering private homes without the prior consent of their occupants. Of course, we don't know what prior consent meant. Let me share an expert documenting breaking and entering by Zapatista soldiers and chiefs. It is from Victoriana Flores, sending a letter to Emiliano Zapata from Huamuxtitlan, Guerrero, in 1914. Colonel Pedro Patron arrived here with his soldiers in April. One night, they broke into my house, smashing down the doors and shouting to my husband that today he would die. He got up and fled naked through a back door. I was so frightened that I couldn't manage to hide, and when they came into the house, they lit a light searching for my husband everywhere, threatening me to hand him over. When they saw he wasn't there, they started abusing and threatening me with their weapons, demanding 300 pesos and whatever weapons my husband had, because they said he was a government supporter, which is not true. To this day, I live a wretched life with my husband, for he is unhappy with all they did to me. And since these men have remained in this town, every time my husband sees them, it is torment for me. I wanted to remain silent, but I have resolved to break the veil of shame, el velo de la vergüenza, to communicate my complaint to you. I thank you in advance and beg you not to answer me, because the letter might fall into my husband's hands, because I do this without his consent. Su más humilde servidora, Victoriana Flores. This letter to Zapata reveals 4 characteristics of systemic violence. First, blaming the victim and defining the enemy within. The Zapatista soldiers who broke into Victoriana Flores' home accused her husband of being a traitor, transforming what would otherwise be recognized as criminal violence into something that appeared justified within revolutionary logic. Number 2, violence always tends to remain hidden. What is not immediately clear is that Victoriana Flores was not only beaten, she was raped. Se aprovecharon de mi debilidad. Rape is frequently concealed within the language used at the time. Abusar de, ultrajar, burlarse de, forzar, hacer uso de. What Pablo Picato points out in his Historia Mínima de la Violencia en México, following Rita Segato, is that in certain contexts, women's bodies become the medium through which men communicate with each other about power, honor, and domination. Men's letters to Zapata or Zapatista authorities regarding rape was about them and their family's honor, and included such terms as atropellar la honradez de mi casa, mancharon mi honra, mujeres de familias decentes. This was, of course, not a new phenomenon. Scholarship on 19th century Mexico demonstrates how the penal codes understood rape primarily as an offense against patriarchal property rights and authority, rather than as violence against the woman herself. And fourth, the key element of systemic violence is that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Victoriana asked Zapata not to reply because her husband, in her words, tormented her. And he might torment her even more if he found out about this letter. The military violence that broke into homes did not enter neutral spaces. It entered domestic spheres, which in early 20th century rural Mexico were already, to a greater or lesser extent, shaped by normalized male violence. Pablo Picato sees these different forms of violence as existing on a spectrum rather than distinct phenomena. And Gemma Santamaria calls it multi-directional violence, radiating outward and inwards simultaneously and blurring all boundaries between political, criminal, and domestic violence. Continuing with a broader discussion about how revolutionary violence enters the domestic sphere, I would like to read you an excerpt from a Zapatista trial. In February 1914, at the Morelos General Headquarters, prisoner José Ramírez from Tlapala, Guerrero, testified the following. On the evening of 29 January, I was drinking in a cantina around 7 o'clock with 2 other men. About an hour later, Celestino Marvan arrived and joined us. Around 11, Marvan invited everyone present to help him abduct Petra Zabaleta, and we immediately agreed. Leaving the cantina, we encountered Gregorio Mata on the road, extended the same invitation, and we proceeded to Petra Zabaleta's house. We forced open the door, entered the home where Zabaleta was sleeping, and forcibly took her. A fuerza la sacamos. I accompanied Marwan in the abduction because I knew he had been romantically involved with her since July of last year. Marwan had gone to Zabaleta's house during the day to falsely warn that government forces were coming to do a conscription sweep, que venía el gobierno a echar leva, ensuring her father would sleep in the hills and the abduction would proceed safely. It was not Marwan, but Gregorio Mata, who had a grudge against Zabaleta's father, tenía enemistad, the one responsible for injuring Pedra Zabaleta's sister and other family members with a knife. Viewed through the framework of contemporary violence studies, this case reveals at least 4 patterns. First, Petra Zabaleta's violent abduction should be understood in the context of a widespread practice in 19th and early 20th century Mexico called bride theft, el robo de la novia. In this tradition, a man, usually young, accompanied by friends, goes to his girlfriend's or goes to a young woman's house at night and abducts her. The practice of robo de la novia exists on a continuum ranging from the consensual elopement of 2 teenagers who are challenging paternal authority to abduction and rape at gunpoint. Yet both fall under the same name, an example of how the boundaries between so-called tradition and violence are easily blurred. The revolutionary movement enabled many young men to invert traditional patriarchal hierarchies through access to weapons, military rank, and military information. In this case, alleged information about the threat of a leva allowed a younger man to bypass the authority of the paterfamilias. I infer from additional archival material on this trial that I haven't read that Petra Zabaleta's father was a man with some political standing, maybe a local cacique, and that the case went from a small village in Guerrero to general headquarters in Morelos, not because of Petra's abduction, but because Gregorio Mata, who harbored a grudge against Zabaleta's father, attacked his family members with a knife. Villages in the midst of revolution were already internally fractured by conflicts over resources, political allegiances, and long-standing personal enmities. The Revolutionary and Civil War conflict provided opportunities to settle old scores between men. Finally, the family members Gregorio Mata injured with a knife were not necessarily only women, but also potentially young boys and elderly men left in the house. What the literature on violence calls feminized bodies in the household hierarchy. In this context, all feminized bodies become the medium through which men communicated with each other about power, honor, and domination. So far, I've spoken about how revolutionary violence entered the villages and then how it entered individual homes. However, the most overlooked side of violence has been the military camps. We know women did take up arms and even commanded troops, but so far little is known about the majority of camp followers. Gabriela Cano, drawing on Eric Hobsbawm's concept of invented tradition, argues that the mythic soldadera and later the Adelita were constructed after the revolution to fit gender stereotypes rather than reflecting women's actual experiences. I have deliberately chosen to focus solely on the Zapatista archives to avoid the biases present in contemporary sources, such as press reports. The only other primary source I do use is the collection of 157 interviews conducted in the 1970s by INA students and professors, Instituto Nacional de Antropología and Historia, as part of the Proyecto Archivo de la Palabra. Their aim was to find surviving Zapatistas. In 1974, Alicia Olivera interviewed a woman chosen for having been the wife of a Zapatista colonel. Olivera asked her if she had carried weapons, if she had seen women who carried weapons, if she had worked as a spy, and how she met her husband. I have edited the interview to include only the interviewee's response to some of these questions. This is Alberta Galindo speaking on tape. Here in Tenango, everyone knows I didn't fall in love with anyone, but it was a jefe who took me away. I used to run errands because my mother made a living selling tamales and tortillas, and I had to help her. Vicente Mungía, a Zapatista colonel under Everardo González, had his headquarters here, where the troops were stationed. One night, he came to take me away, and although in those days, if a girl was taken, she was later returned to her home, they put 7 or 8 soldiers on me so that I wouldn't leave. In the camp, the women ground corn, made tortillas, and fed the troops. Women always cooked for the jefes and the troops. We did not carry guns. We did not do spy work. We prepared food and took care of the children. There were many children. For me, it was complicated at the time. I was a young person. I figured that she was about 13 when she was abducted. I was without a mother, without a father, without brothers or sisters. What could I do? I was in the mountains in the middle of a battle that was taking place in this area. When Vicente Mujia was killed in battle, a woman at the camp said to me, "Look, you're alone now. You have no one to take care of you. Let's go work at whatever we can find in Amecameca, and then you can look for your mother, see if she's still alive." That's what we did. I'm very grateful to that woman because she gave me advice. She has since passed away, but I will always remember her. These camps became sites where women and girls were displaced from their communities, not through mass reconcentration as carried out before the revolution by Porfirio Diaz or during the revolution by the armies of Victoriano Huerta and Venustiano Carranza, but through individual and small group abductions. I have found many individual abductions disguised as marriages, like the one I've just described. There were cases where women prisoners were sent to the camps. For lack of prisons, Zapatista soldiers accused of treason or supposed enemy soldiers were often shot, but the accompanied women were sent to the camps to grind corn and cook for the troops. There were also group kidnappings. There are many complaints from men from many villages about the abduction of women, usually described by their relationship to the complaining men: viudas, casadas, solteras, hijas. The worst report we have on file is from Atlatlauca, State of Mexico in 1917, where residents reported that Zapatista Captain Pablo Plata and his soldiers took 30 women. 18 of these women, girls, were ages 10 to 12. The 30 women and children were held at the camp for 3 days, 2 nights. They were raped and then they were sent home. Taken together, these and many other examples demonstrate that camps operated as zones where trafficking of women for labor extraction and sexual exploitation was practiced and tolerated. These were not crimes committed in secret, but acts that occurred within the organizational structure of revolutionary forces and witnessed by many men who either participated, observed, or remained silent. The woman who rescued Alberta Galindo told her that she no longer had somebody to protect her and that they should leave and find work in Amecameca. As with the economy of extraction, where Zapatistas claimed to protect villages from violence that often came from their own soldiers, here the abductor became the protector against possible violence from other men. The protection racket operated not only through resource extraction, but also through control over women's bodies and lives. So, how did the Zapatista authorities react to the more than 700 complaints about violence against Pacíficos? My research reveals that the Zapatista justice system operated on two parallel tracks, depending on whether cases were civil or criminal. For civil cases, mainly theft, inheritance, small property disputes, Zapatistas retained existing judges and largely followed 19th century civil law as far as they could. For all else, the Zapatista justice system was fundamentally military and militarized. It was military because, at least in principle, it relied on 19th century military justice codes to try enemy soldiers, spies, and traitors. It was militarized because general headquarters extended jurisdiction beyond the military sphere. It prosecuted Zapatista soldiers who committed violence against Pacíficos, but they also assumed jurisdiction over criminal proceedings involving only civilians. For this talk, I will focus only on the militarization of justice in terms of the crimes committed against the Pacíficos. Let me share with you excerpts from the letter Emiliana Romero from Chietla, Puebla, dictated to Emiliano Zapata in 1915. When I saw Captain Reyes Flores walking in the plaza, the man who had abducted my 14-year-old daughter, Otilia Lopez, I filed a complaint with a correctional judge for breaking and entering, rape and abduction. The judge notified the military chief, who at 9 a.m. sent 2 soldiers to bring me and Otilia to the municipal presidency's office. There I found Colonel Francisco Pliego, the municipal president, the correctional judge, Captain Reyes Flores, and about 12 soldiers I didn't know. The military chief took declarations from me and my daughter and said that the one responsible for the crimes committed by Reyes Flores was my daughter, because Reyes Flores claimed that while in a relationship with her, she was involved with other men. As proof, he presented as witness the 15-year-old Sofia Machado, who then publicly argued with Otilia. The military chief intimidated me, saying that if I did not withdraw my complaint, I would have to go to general headquarters in Cuernavaca with my daughter. As I belong to the poor and needy people, a la gente pobre y menesterosa, I'm a single woman who supports 2 minor daughters with no money for expenses in Cuernavaca. I was forced, against all my will, to pardon the aforementioned delinquent. In my humble opinion, the reasoning the military chief used to absolve the armed man had no application, because the fact that my daughter was not faithful in a romantic relationship did not give him the right to break into my home or abduct my daughter as he did, especially being 14 years old. Here we see a militarized court system, right? Although Emilia Romero filed her complaint with a correctional judge, he immediately deferred to the military chief, who conducted the investigation, took declarations, and adjudicated guilt. In Zapatista military and militarized courts, punishments for abuses typically meant reprimands, transfers to other zones, under a different commander or stripping offenders of their weapons. In extreme cases of repeated theft, abuse, or murder, some did face military trial and execution. In most cases, however, it was a judicial system that left violence unpunished through collusion and acquiescence. This was not something new, of course. Since the 19th century, women's behavior had been a key factor in cases of domestic violence. Rulings considered a woman's perceived fidelity, obedience, and modesty, revealing that there was a widespread acceptance that gender violence was justifiable under certain conditions and that women were often at fault. We also have the work of Ana Lidia Garcia Peña, who studied the Porfirian military before the revolution and found not only increased criminal behavior by armed men, but also greater impunity due to the fuero militar, or military personnel's right to trial in a military rather than a civilian court. What was particular to the Zapatista case was that military titles for revolutionary chiefs depended not only on their performance in battles, but also on the number of men that they commanded. Individual jefes could not afford to lose combatants to prosecution for crimes against civilians, much less against women. The guerrilla organization replicated village family structures within the military hierarchy, creating a kinship-based power system. A lot of these chiefs had family members and compadrazgo bonds in their military groups. And so for them, it was important to shield friends and relatives from prosecution for crimes against civilians. And perhaps most importantly, the Zapatista leadership prioritized military capacity over justice, viewing prosecution of soldiers for civilian abuses as undermining their forces during a civil war, right? Military necessity became the justification for impunity in the middle of a civil war. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yep. Thank you very much. So we have a little time for questions that we can take either from the Zoom public or from the people here present. So just raise your hand wherever you are and we'll find you. I mean, maybe while people come up with their questions, I'll ask a very general one to begin, which is, I mean, this is very interesting and obviously also disturbing and so on. I guess, how do you think, in general terms, I mean, I know it's more complicated, how do you think that this kind of, that these situations, that these findings, how do they change, if they do, you think, the way we think or ought to think about Zapatismo in the context of the literature you cited at the beginning of your talk? And you can go ahead and answer. We'll do it one by one.
How will it change the existing literature?
Or the way we think about Zapatismo as a movement. Historians, or more broadly, the public, if you want, you can choose your target there. It's a big question, I know, but
yes.
So we're just interested in your reaction.
I mean, that's my main thought, that I am talking about violence in a movement that is so idealized and respected in Mexico. No, John Womack in 2023, so 3 years ago, wrote a preface to one of the latest Zapata books saying that he was the genuine revolutionary. And so it is very hard to try and figure out what how this is going to be taken by other scholars. I mean, the main reason I started doing this work, I've been working on Zapatismo for a long time, and you know, this drip, drip, drip of violence was always there. But in 2020, a book came out by a famous historian called Las Compañeras de Zapata. And it talked about Zapata's supposed partners. Some say they were 11, others say they were 22. Apparently, he had 15 kids and only 5 managed to become adults. The other ones died. But it was a book basically saying, look, Zapata was a womanizer, and here are all his compañeras. In that book, which is small, short, not very detailed, there are 4 cases of forced abduction of minors. And yet, one of the ones that was abducted is justified as having been La Favorita de Zapata. What was her name? Goyita Zúñiga, because she was there when he died. This was very, very hard for me. And because I think Pablo Picato really, in his Historia Mínima de la Violencia en México, really captures the essence of revolutionary Mexico in terms of being, he himself says, there haven't been enough studies, but rape is a central topic of revolutionary Mexico. So for me, the most important project was to make violence visible, because it is very invisible, and once it's discovered, it gets hidden away. And maybe that's sort of the long circle, that I'm afraid that a study like this might just, you know, hide it away again, and Zapata will continue to be, you know, untouchable, and his movement heroic. And I'm not interested in criticizing Zapata or criticizing Carranza or anyone else. I think what is very valuable about this new literature is that it focuses on violence and how it functions, regardless of whether we're talking about heroes or who we're talking about.
Thank you. Questions? I mean, you can speak up, and if you can't hear you, then I'll repeat it. So make it short.
Well, thank you, Professor. I found your analysis very insightful and persuasive. I think I also had a broader question about the role of the revolution, which in a way is exceptional, like the violence that occurs during a revolution. One could argue is more than in non-revolutionary times. And so I wonder what is at stake in focusing on that 10 years of tumult, and whether you would be able to propose a similarly insightful framework during conflicts in the Porfiriato, for instance, at a village level. I guess what I'm asking is, yeah, what is the focus on the revolution itself, if your interest is violence, help with, and what does it obscure? Does that make sense?
It is a huge question. I'm mostly interested in how the judiciaries function, even though it was just the end of it. When I'm in this book I'm writing, every single chapter will have a section on how the Zapatista justice system dealt with violence, but also because I've done a lot of work on late 19th century Mexican violence, comparing it. The continuities are absolutely incredible. So I can say more about the past than the 20s, 30s, and on. So for me, it was very important, number one, to show that the Zapatista justice system actually did take a lot of the elements of the Porfirian justice system, especially concepts about gender and power. So that is my most, that's how I entered this whole topic of violence. What is very interesting is that the scholars on the justice system usually only study the Porfiriato, oops, then there was a rupture. I mean, I'm being very reductive, but oops, there was the revolution, and then what happened after 1917. And what I and other scholars are finding is that during the revolution, there were actually different kinds of justice systems. Salvador Alvarado, Stephanie Smith has a wonderful older book on Salvador Alvarado's. I think they only functioned for 2 years. Carrancista justice systems appeared in different states. And of course, the Zapatistas had this justice system. But to connect it, there's one way I'm thinking about how to connect it, let's say, post 1920. And this is something that I am just now working on. And that is, in these villages, they had something called veintenas. Veintenas comes from the number 20. I don't know exactly how it worked in the 19th century, but they're 20 men who are supposed to be guarding the villages at night. And it was twofold. On the one hand, Zapatista laws required pueblos, and that's why I said that they also extracted labor. They required pueblos to form their own, like, local guards to help out the soldiers, identify if there was going to be a military attack or whatever, or to guard against thieves or whatever. But these veintenas actually started becoming also groups that opposed Zapatista violence. So here are Pacificos who are basically Zapatistas, well, have sympathies towards Zapata, but that organize groups to protect themselves against this revolutionary movement. And I think this links very nicely to the studies that scholars are now starting to work on in the 20s, which is these proto-self-defense groups in villages, and who's armed and who is working with the military or with the state and who isn't, and all these very, very interesting studies now in the 1920s about challenging the concept, this Weberian concept of the monopoly over violence, right? These types of studies. So I don't know if that answers it, but that's about as I will think about your question.
Thank you.
Fernando Pérez Montesinos.
Yes, Fernando, go ahead.
Hi, Helga. Hi, Emilio.
Let's turn it. Hold on a second so we can turn up the volume. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, Helga. Hi, Emilio. Thank you for that absolutely amazing talk, Helga. I think this is truly groundbreaking research, and I'm utterly convinced by your argument that violence within the Zapatista army was systemic, and it was rooted, of course, in violence that occurred in the 19th century. But I also wonder about whether are you finding patterns, because I know that you have enough material to see how these distinct uses of violence evolve over time. So it's very technical. My question is whether are you seeing some sort of patterns from 1910 to 1920? Does the violence intensify? And finally, I think that I think that using Rita Segato's framework, it's the right framework, and that will give your research a lot of, if you will, protection against people who might see this as implicit attack on revolutionary principles, because I think what Rita Segato discusses, and then Pablo Picato, and then you, it's really larger than just specific revolutionary moments or not. It's essentially to understand how patriarchy works. So I think that absolutely will help to make your case, even to those who are skeptic. But anyways, my question is really simple: are you finding patterns how the violence evolve? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I might have caricatured the established narrative a little bit. Of course, there is some truth to it. There's actually a lot of truth to it. There was a big difference between having 5,000 soldiers in 1911 and having 30,000 soldiers in 1914, 1915. Violence did increase. Violence did increase because the resources were fewer and fewer. People were starving. They were sick. Things did get definitely worse. So that is one pattern which we cannot disagree with. But it was important for me to say, hey, you guys, which archives did you read? Because if you go to the AGN Genovevo de la O's archives, who started collecting these petitions much earlier than the rest of them, we have proof from 1911 that this is the way it functioned. And there too, you saw the receipts were like super nice. They were like, we are giving, Otilia Mendoza a receipt for 5 pesos, and we promise to pay back once the revolution has triumphed. And it gets worse and worse. So that is one pattern. There's one thing that I haven't fully managed to get a grasp on, and that is the petitions to Zapata. Of course, we know that anybody who studied the 19th centuries knows that unlettered people also sent petitions, and they sent petitions to governors and the president and everybody. There is something about these petitions to revolutionary Zapatista leaders. I feel they're slightly less, I think there's slightly less of a class and race issue here. I think that people who wrote to Zapata and to Genovevo de la O and to other generals truly felt they were part of the same community, the same villages, the same background. And there's some elements, this is again linked to what I had said before, and that is that men viewed women as part of themselves or the family. So widows became a very important element to protect in Zapatista Morelos. So there are some things that I can try and understand so that it doesn't seem like some sort of an attack on the Zapatistas. I think that if we had the same material for the other revolutionary groups, we would be saying very similar things. Different contexts. I mean, the militaries were very different. The fact that this is a guerrilla military makes it very particular, which I try to explain. But I think any region, and as a matter of fact, any war, any military conflict, you have these layers upon layers upon layers of violence. So anyway, I don't know if.
Thank you. Yes. We have time for one more question. Daniel?
Yeah.
Just speak up.
Thank you, Professor. This was very interesting and revealing. I have a question similar to Benjamin's, but maybe more conceptual in that sense. And I was curious how if you thought at any time about this concept that is also very used in the studies of violence, that is the state of exception. And how do you think about the state of exception during the revolutionary period? Because I understand that the thing about periodizing Mexican violence from 1920 onwards is because maybe in 1920 we start having a sketch of what the Mexican post-revolutionary state will look like, but not before. And hence, I mean, many people characterize this period as some sort of state of exception in which there is no consolidated authority, in that way. So I was just curious if this concept appeared while you were writing, and how you thought about violence in relation to this idea of state of exception, and who has the power to state what the exception is in very Michigan or Gambian terms.
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I have not. I will definitely think about it and take that on. There's still a chunk of the literature that I haven't quite processed yet. I think where I come from is sort of the other extreme, and that is that in history, for a long time, in historical studies, for a long time, the Zapatistas were seen as basically supporting a lot of local autonomy. And what I'm trying to show here, and I'm not the only one, this is actually comes from much earlier studies, who say, wait a moment, here we really do have a government, a functioning government. And that's why I'm so interested in trying to describe the judicial system. So now I then have to figure out how this fits into the state of exception. But I've been coming from the other angle to say there was really very little autonomy here. That they didn't necessarily control the whole territory, of course not. But this was, to an extent, a functioning government. And it was so precisely because they tried to rescue what was good, what functioned from the Porfiriato. The Zapatistas were much less concerned about fighting, I don't know, vestiges from the Porfiriato. If they worked and the judge was not an enemy, he was an ally, well, so be it, there's the judge. So I come from the other extreme, but I will think about that. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time, so all that remains is to thank Helga Baitenmann for this very thought-provoking presentation, which is part of a larger project underway. So we very much look forward to seeing how it develops, and we also look forward to inviting you again to tell us more about it when it's finished. Thank you to all of you for accompanying us today, and we hope that you join the seminar when it meets next. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone.